In this series of short videos, we're going to be looking at getting started with SPSS syntax. So this will be useful for people who maybe use SPSS statistics already, and they may have seen some syntax, may have seen it displayed in the log in the output viewer window, or maybe they've clicked paste within a dialog box and they've seen some syntax that SPSS is generating, and maybe they're a little bit curious about that and want to find out a little bit more and how they can exploit that. Well, the first thing we want to talk about really is, before we get into actually generating syntax and editing it and making sense of it, is just a little bit of context, right? A little bit of historical context. And that is basically SPSS syntax dates back to the 1960s, and it is effectively the core system that drives SPSS. And it's effectively a command language that's unique to SPSS statistics, so specifically built for SPSS. It's effectively like SPSS's operating system. It was developed in the 1960s, as I say, and so that means it predates Windows and current Apple versions of SPSS by some margin. You know, around about the 1970s, when people were working with SPSS, they're working with them on mainframe machines such as Unix or VAX mainframes, and they're typing in SPSS syntax to make it work. And even in the 1980s, when we have PCs coming along, they're DOS-based PCs, so that means that people are typing in text effectively to make it work. So PC plus SPSS, PC plus becomes a very popular desktop version of SPSS. And then 1992 is really when the first SPSS for Windows release comes out. And then around about 2009, of course, SPSS Statistics is acquired by IBM. So it effectively becomes IBM SPSS Statistics. And since then, there's been additional functionality that's been added to it right up until the current and present day. So before the 1990s, users of SPSS relied on syntax manuals in order to learn how to use the software. If you wanted to run a particular procedure, you weren't really familiar with that procedure, you looked it up in one of these big manuals. And believe it or not, the syntax was actually quite popular because it was regarded as relatively easy, and because these manuals meant that it was very well documented. So people liked it because it was fairly easy to use. It tended to use quite plain English commands. If you wanted to run a crosstab, you typed in crosstabs. You wanted to run a frequency table, you typed in frequencies, that type of thing. So it was fairly straightforward, and it was well documented. And people really liked it. So why would we use SPSS syntax today, given the fact that we've got, you know, a nice Windows-based or Apple-based interface that we can rely on to execute our tasks? Well, first of all, it allows us to automate the entire analytical process. So if you're doing regular reports, for example, you can automate the entire thing using SPSS syntax. And we'll take a look at that in our final example in this series of videos. Secondly, if you're doing a lot of repetitive tasks, so let's say, for example, you're doing a whole bunch of charts and you're using a slightly different combination of variables each time, you could just paste that as syntax and then copy and paste the syntax repeatedly over and over again. And all you'd have to do then is just change or edit the name of the fields in each part of the syntax. And then you could recreate or execute the entire thing in one go. It would be a much more productive way to do it, rather than perhaps, you know, going back to the dialog box each time and re-specifying which fields or which variables you wanted to work with. A very good reason is if you make a mistake, if you want to change or fix something to update all your work. So let's say, for example, you've done a lot of work and you realize that actually you should have had a filter on that. You should have been looking at people aged over 30, or you should have been focused on or excluding a certain group, a certain region, for example, from your work. If everything's pasted as syntax, it's very easy to then just put a selection statement right at the start of that syntax and then re-execute everything, and it will just update all of your work. You don't have to go back and go through the whole thing again using dialog boxes. Fourthly, you can actually share your data preparation and your analysis with others. So you can say, this is the analysis I did, here's the data file I worked on, and you can send that across and they can recreate exactly what you're doing. And in that spirit, you can also have effectively an audit trail or a record of your work that you can use from a sort of data governance standpoint. So there's a lot of different reasons why syntax is powerful and useful, and we'll illustrate some of those as we're going along. But you should be aware that the vast majority of tasks that you would normally execute in IBM SPSS statistics using dialog boxes can in fact be completed using SPSS syntax. So pretty much most procedures have an SPSS syntax equivalent, and the SPSS syntax is a command language that is easier to understand than a lot of the more popular analytical programming languages out there, such as Python or R. So from that standpoint alone, it's worth having a look at. Now, you heard me mentioning something about pasting syntax earlier on. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about there, suffice to say that when you run a procedure in SPSS, you're usually doing that through a dialog box, and dialog boxes have common buttons such as help buttons or cancel buttons or reset and OK to execute it. And next to the OK button, you'll get this little button here marked paste. And paste simply, when we click on the paste button, as we will do for this particular procedure, it shows us the underlying syntax. So here we have a frequencies table of a single variable called employment category, and it's based on a data set that we're going to use to illustrate syntax in this session. The data set's called employee data with age, and it's based on the employee data, the employee sample data set that you get with IBM SPSS statistics. IBM SPSS statistics comes with a sample folder of data sets to work with. So this is a slightly different version of it where we've calculated the field age already. And if I click paste, instead of it generating the frequency table, instead what it does is it opens up a new window. And this new window is an SPSS syntax editor window. And it shows us the underlying syntax that it would execute if we clicked OK. So it doesn't actually produce the output, it just simply shows us the syntax. So if we wanted to execute that in order to create the frequency table, what we'd do is we'd run the syntax. And one way in which we could do that is simply by clicking on the run menu at the top here and then selecting all. And that means it would run everything that it could see in the syntax window, and that would generate for us a frequency table of the field job cat or employment category with 3 different employment categories and frequency counts. In other words, identical to the output we would get if we clicked OK. And just to illustrate that, if I just go to employee data here with age and go to analyze descriptive statistics frequencies, and I select employment category and click OK, it generates that. If I go back and click frequencies again, and then this time hit paste, it shows me the syntax here, the exact same syntax we mentioned earlier on. Let's just have a quick look back at our syntax and see if we can make sense of what's actually happening there. And the first thing is that we can see that there are 2 procedures in here. One's called a dataset activate command. So this is the dataset activate command we could see there. And the second one was the frequencies command. So we didn't just see a frequencies procedure, we saw this dataset activate procedure as well. And I need to talk about that a little bit so that you're not confused by it and you can make sense of why it's got this weird dataset activate command in at the start. And the thing you have to be aware of is that when SPSS statistics opens a new data file, it actually gives it a little label by default. It gives it its own label, if you like, and it calls it, as you would understand it, dataset 1 or $dataset 1, the dollar indicating that it's a system label it's giving it. So if we then went and opened up another data set, I mean, the other data set might be called anything, it might be called revenue, it might be called geography or something like that. But when it opens it, it gives it a little label and it calls it $dataset 2. And it keeps doing that as we add new data sets. If you open new data sets, we've got multiple data sets open, it's calling it dataset 1, dataset 2, dataset 3. So that means that if you execute a command like frequencies, it needs to know which dataset you want to execute it against. So it adds the dataset activate command before the relevant procedure, in this case, frequencies. So we'd expect it to say dataset activate dataset 1. Except in our case, it just said dataset and not dataset 1. So what's going on there? Well, the fact is that we can ask SPSS statistics to open only one dataset at a time, and that's what I've done. And you can do that by going to the edit menu in SPSS if you're not familiar with this, and going to the options item right at the bottom. And that will open up a dialog box with lots of tabs in it, and those tabs allow you to change the default settings in SPSS. So my default setting is usually just to open one dataset at a time. I find it too confusing to have multiple datasets open at a time. And because it can only open one dataset at a time, of course, everything's given the same label. It just labels it as dataset, not dataset 1, dataset 2, dataset 3. So just to show you where that is, if I just go to edit here and go to edit options, you can see here down here, open one dataset at a time, which means that everything's just given the label $dataset, not $dataset1, not $dataset2 or anything like that. So that's what's happening there. So as a result of that, you know, this dataset activate command isn't necessary. It isn't actually needed because there's only one dataset open. It's only necessary if you've got multiple datasets open and you need to tell it which dataset the syntax actually applies to. So if you've got that open one dataset at a time, you don't have to worry about it. Okay, let's look at the frequencies procedure itself then, which is our kind of main procedure. And we'll break it down. You can see that there are different color codes here. And you can see I've labeled them 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the syntax for frequency procedure is actually very simple. And as with all syntax procedures, it starts with a single command. So this is a command word or command phrase. And the command here is frequencies. It says that this procedure is called frequencies. And that's followed by a keyword, an optional keyword, which is highlighted in red, and that's variables. And it says, okay, we're going to do a frequencies, and here are the variables. Then it specifies the variable, which is jobcat, so variables equals jobcat. And that's followed by a slash with a subcommand and another keyword, which means slash order analysis. And finally, the procedure is completed with a single period character. It's got this little full stop at the end. Now, the thing that's really important here is frequencies, the name of the field, and the full stop, really. This other stuff here is it's pasting it in, and they're effectively default. Slash order analysis just means the order in which the frequency categories are shown, really. So it tends to paste a little bit more syntax than we actually need. And as we'll see, we can actually have a much simpler version of the syntax. But the key bit here is that all syntax begins with a command word, ends with a full stop, and has something in between. Some of the stuff that's in between is kind of optional, and some of it's default, if you like. So that's the only thing you need to kind of take away at this stage. So if we want to run this, we can highlight a specific procedure, and we can actually use this little green button here, or we can simply say run all. So this little green button here allows us to run just the bit that we've highlighted. That's something that's important because you might have lots and lots of different statements open. You might have a cross tab, you might have 3 or 4 different frequencies. You don't want to run them all, you just want to run part of it. So you just highlight the bit that you want to run, and you click the run button here, which is effectively saying run that selection, which is useful to know about. And secondly, the pasted syntax, as I say, tends to be a bit more verbose, and it's often required. SPSS will run syntax assuming default settings, so sometimes you can actually make the syntax much simpler. And this is because historically the syntax predates environments like Microsoft Windows. It was designed to be typed. And for instance, the following simpler syntax works just as well as the pasted frequency syntax. You can literally just type in a shortened version of the word frequencies, which is freak, and then just the name of the field. So if I just go back to SPSS statistics and show you that, you'll see that it'll just assume all of the other bits in it. So you can also see here that it's actually trying to fill in the values here. So we'll come to that in more detail later. But if I just type in freak jobcat full stop, the most important thing is to have a keyword. If I highlight that and run that, it just creates another copy, if you like, of that frequency table. So that's worth knowing about, that you can actually have shorter versions of syntax, slightly more summarized versions. And the other thing about syntax is that it's actually remarkably unfussy about how it's typed compared to other languages, for example. It's not case sensitive, generally speaking. It doesn't really care if you've got lots of different lines in between, parts of the syntax, if you've got lots of lines in between different sections of commands. It doesn't require it to be indented in any particular way normally, not normally. And we can get away with 3 or 4 letter abbreviations for lots of command specifications. There are some basic rules, however. Each command, as I say, has to begin on a new line. It has to have a command word at the start, so frequencies. and each procedure has to end with a period, which it calls a period or a full stop. It calls this the command terminator. So if you forget to put in a full stop, sometimes you get a little message saying it's missing a command terminator. And most subcommands are separated by slashes. The slash before the first subcommand on a command is usually optional. So again, not terribly fussy, but most subcommands tend to have slashes. And sometimes you might actually want to add a comment in your syntax. So anything between an asterisk and a period is treated as a comment, and it's therefore ignored. And you can also add a comment after a command terminator on the same line by adding a slash in front of the asterisk. So I can say, here's a comment. This is an example syntax for a frequencies procedure. And anything I put with between an asterisk and a full stop is ignored. It's turned gray. And if I want to put a little comment at the end of the procedure, if I put slash asterisks and then a full stop, it'll help. That'll be useful. And another useful feature of the syntax comments is that you can tell a system to ignore a procedure. So you can, what we call, comment it out. You might want to, for example, just take out a selection. Maybe you got a filter in there. Maybe there's a field. Maybe there's a procedure which is, really messy, and you just want to take it out temporarily for testing purposes. If you just put an asterisk in front of it, it grays it out. So again, if I just go back out to the syntax here and show you here, and I go, let's put an asterisk in front of this and say, this is the short version. You can see it's all coming out in black thus far. Everything's turning grey now because it's looking at everything between this asterisk and this full stop. But if I put a full stop in there, or period there, you can see that it knows that that's a comment. It's turning grey, and it will ignore that. It won't mess up the code, in other words, if I put that in. So commenting stuff is worth knowing about as well. And lastly, we've got some syntax color codes, and these are the default color codes that SPSS uses to make the syntax more readable. So commands tend to be dark blue, subcommands tend to be green, optional keywords dark red, the variable names and optional text tends to be black. Sometimes you'll see orange appearing. That usually refers to specific values, a particular cutoff value, let's say like a 95% cutoff value, or the number of cases you want to select, something like that. And grey, as we noticed, is usually refers to comments. You should also note that the default colors can be changed. If you don't like the default colors, you can change them once again under the Edit Options menu.